There are moments in a man's life when the ordinary becomes the threshold to the extraordinary, when a routine morning, a familiar smell of motor oil and steel, and the quiet rhythm of wrench on bolt suddenly give way to something that rewrites everything he thought he knew. Marcus Johnson had lived 48 years without anyone handing him a single thing. He had earned every callus on his palms, every gray thread at his temples, every dollar that kept the lights on at his small garage on the outskirts of Atlanta. He was not a man who expected surprises. He was not a man who looked for trouble. But when a sleek black SUV, worth several $100,000, rolled up to his bay door one Tuesday morning, and its owner stepped out like she had never once looked at the ground beneath her feet, Marcus could not have known that the next few days would crack open a wound 18 years old and finally, after all that time, begin to let it heal. What he found hidden beneath the driver's seat of that car would not just threaten a powerful woman's empire. It would reach back across nearly 2 decades of grief, silence, and unanswered questions to touch the single loss that had never stopped hurting. The kind of loss a man carries quietly, not because it has grown lighter, but because he has simply learned to walk with the weight. Marcus Johnson was the kind of man who fixed things. That was the simplest way to say it, and the truest. He had opened Johnson's Auto and Repair at the age of 26 with a used hydraulic lift, $1,200 in savings, and a reputation built on word of mouth in a neighborhood where word traveled fast and forgiveness traveled slow. By the time he was 30, 3 other shops in the area had shuttered or been bought out by chains, and Marcus was still there, still open 6 days a week, still doing the work himself, because he trusted his own hands more than anyone else's. By 48, he had seen thousands of cars come and go through that single bay, had diagnosed problems that dealerships had missed, had turned away jobs he considered dishonest, and had built a quiet, unshakable standing in the community that no amount of advertising could have purchased. His name meant something. Not to everyone, certainly not to the wealthier clients who occasionally pulled in with European sedans and barely made eye contact, but to the people who mattered, the ones who sent their daughters to him with used hatchbacks before those daughters drove cross-country for college, the ones who trusted Marcus with the only vehicle standing between them and a lost job. He knew what he was worth. He had always known. The problem was that the world had not always agreed. There were customers who spoke to him slowly, as if his coveralls indicated something about his intelligence rather than his profession. There were men who had questioned his estimates, not because his numbers were wrong, but because they were surprised a man who looked like Marcus could have arrived at them. He never argued. He never raised his voice. He showed them the work, explained the parts, handed them the invoice, and let the quality speak for itself. Over 20 years, that patience had built something impenetrable. But it had also cost him something, a particular kind of weariness that settled into a man's bones when he has spent his whole life being underestimated and has chosen every single time to respond with dignity instead of anger. That choice, repeated 1,000 times over 2 decades, had shaped him into someone steady and certain, in ways that confrontation never could have. He had learned that the truth of a man's character was most visible, not in his grand moments, but in the accumulation of small ones. The invoice he could have padded, but didn't. The part he could have marked up but charged at cost. The customer he stayed late for on a Friday because she had to pick up her children and had nowhere else to go. His mother, Ruth Johnson, understood that cost better than anyone. She was 72 now, slower on her feet, spending most of her days in the back bedroom of the small house Marcus had bought for her 8 years prior, just 4 miles from the shop. He checked on her every morning before opening and every evening before driving home. She made him coffee he did not ask for and offered opinions on his life he did not request, and he accepted both with equal gratitude. She was the person who had kept him intact after the worst thing that had ever happened to him. There were photographs on her dresser Marcus in his coveralls, a younger version of himself with grease on his forearms and a grin wider than he remembered ever feeling, standing outside the garage the day he had first put up his sign. There were other photographs, too. One she kept turned slightly away from direct view, as if the angle reduced the ache of it. A young man in his early 30s, bright-eyed, standing in front of a car he was proud of, smiling at whoever held the camera. Marcus's brother, Derek, had died 18 years ago. 31 years old, driving home from a late meeting on a rainy Wednesday in November, when his car had left the highway and struck a concrete barrier at high speed, the kind of sudden, final violence that left no time for questions and provided very few answers afterward. The investigation had lasted 6 weeks. The conclusion had been rain-slicked roads, excessive speed, driver error. The case was closed. The death certificate said accident, but Marcus had known his brother. Derek did not speed. Derek had been meticulous, careful, a man who checked his tire pressure monthly and never drove without his seatbelt. He had been the kind of person who called ahead if he was going to be 5 minutes late, the kind of person who double-checked the stove before leaving the house, who put his seatbelt on before starting the engine, who drove as if the road were something to be respected rather than conquered. An accident of this kind, at that speed, had never made sense to the people who had known him. It had made sense only on paper, where a conclusion could be reached without knowing the man. The explanation had never sat right with Marcus. Not then, and not now, though he had never been able to articulate what exactly felt wrong, only that something did, something deep and wordless and persistent. He had carried that unresolved feeling for 18 years, like a stone in his chest, not crushing exactly, but always present, always there. He had learned to work around it. He had learned to keep moving. And on the Tuesday morning when a sleek, dark SUV with tinted windows idled to a stop in front of his bay door, Marcus was doing exactly that. Moving, focused, entirely absorbed in the transmission, on a customer's pickup truck, completely unprepared for what was about to begin. The SUV arrived without a phone call or an appointment, which was the first thing that struck him as unusual. The vehicle was an imported luxury model, the kind with a wheelbase long enough to suggest it had been custom configured, finished in a shade of black, so deep it seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. The door opened, and a woman stepped out in a charcoal blazer and heels that were entirely inappropriate for a gravel parking lot, though she navigated the surface with the practiced ease of someone who had long since stopped letting the terrain dictate her pace. Marcus recognized her within the first few seconds. Not personally, but in the way that Atlanta residents recognized Victoria Hayes from business journals, from the covers of regional magazines, from the occasional morning news segment about the technology sector's most influential figures. She was the chief executive of Nexum Technologies, a company she had built from a regional software firm into a national platform provider over the course of 15 years. She was 51 years old, though she looked younger, with the controlled posture and deliberate composure of someone who had learned that every room she entered was being watched and had decided long ago to give the watchers nothing they had not already been permitted to see. She carried herself with the precision of someone for whom image was not vanity, but strategy, every detail considered, every interaction calibrated, every environment navigated as a problem to be managed, rather than a place to simply be. She stopped at the edge of the bay, not coming inside, and looked past Marcus, as if locating something in the middle distance. He set down his wrench and walked toward her, wiping his hands on a shop rag. He introduced himself. She did not offer her hand. She told him the vehicle had been making a sound when turning at low speeds, possibly a power steering issue, and that she needed it addressed quickly. She said this while looking at the car rather than at Marcus, her attention arranged in the particular way of someone accustomed to transactions rather than conversations people reduced to their function, interactions reduced to their outcome. She placed a business card on the hood of the nearest vehicle, not in Marcus's hand, on the hood, and told him to call her when it was ready. She pulled out her phone before she had finished speaking, and by the time he had begun to confirm the job, she was already walking toward a second vehicle that had pulled up behind the SUV, presumably to collect her. She did not say goodbye. She did not acknowledge his name. She was gone in under 90 seconds. Marcus stood in the quiet left behind her departure, looked at the business card still sitting on the hood, and picked it up. He set it on his workbench, noted the cell number, pulled the SUV into the bay, and got to work. He had dealt with her type before. He would fix the car, charge a fair rate, and that would be the end of it. Except that it was not the end of anything. It was, in ways Marcus could not yet see, the beginning of everything that had been waiting for him. The power steering check took less than an hour. Marcus completed it, identified the source of the sound, a worn bushing in the steering column housing, and noted 2 additional issues on the undercarriage that would need attention within the next several months. He photographed everything, wrote up a quote, and called the number on the business card. The call rang through to voicemail. He left a clear, professional message with the details and asked her to call back to authorize the repair. He expected a return call before noon. Noon came and went. He called again in the early afternoon and again just before closing. Each time, voicemail. He tried the main number listed for Nexum Technologies on the card and reached a general operator who took his message and said someone would follow up. No one followed up. By the end of the first day, Marcus had filed the car in the back of his mind as a waiting job and moved on to other work. By the end of the third day, with the SUV still occupying his second bay and his calls still unanswered, he began to feel the first faint edges of something he could not quite name, not concern, exactly, but a kind of alertness, the particular attention of a man who notices when the ordinary stops behaving ordinarily. On the fourth day, he reached out to the business number again and was told, with a careful formality, that it self-communicated more than the words, that Miss Hayes was unavailable and that her office would be in touch at the earliest opportunity. No name was given, no timeline was offered. On the fifth day, Marcus began to look more carefully at the vehicle itself, not because he intended to go beyond the scope of his job, but because a week of diagnostic work had left him curious about the electrical irregularities he kept encountering in the system readouts. The onboard diagnostics showed faint anomalies in the power distribution to the lower dash panel. Not a malfunction exactly, more like a ghost, a trace of something that had been drawing current at some point, something that was no longer present or no longer active. He pulled the service manual on his tablet and cross-referenced the wiring diagram. What he found did not match. There was a section of the lower driver's side interior, behind the trim panel beneath the steering column, where the wiring showed evidence of modification. Not factory modification. Something added, or changed, by hand. Careful work, done by someone who knew what they were doing, but not factory work. Marcus sat back on his rolling stool and looked at the car for a long moment. Then he reached for his panel removal tool and began to take it apart. What Marcus found behind that trim panel was not a bomb, not contraband, not anything he had a word for in the first moment of finding it. It was a cavity, a small rectangular void that had been engineered into the space between the factory panel and the structural frame, sealed with a magnetic closure that was completely invisible unless you were looking at the wiring and wondering why it did not match the schematic. Inside the cavity were 3 objects. The first was a USB drive, black, unmarked, the small kind that fit flush into a laptop port. The second was an envelope, cream-colored, sealed, old enough that the paper had developed a faint yellow cast along the edges, the kind of aging that took years. The third was a small, flat key, the type used for safe deposit boxes at financial institutions, with a number etched into the head, 4 digits, no bank name, no other identifying information. Marcus held all 3 in his palm for a moment, sitting cross-legged on his shop floor in the particular silence of a garage after hours. The bay doors rolled down, the fluorescent lights buzzing their steady low note above him. He set them on his workbench and stared at them. His first instinct was to call a lawyer, or the police, or both. His second instinct was to simply lock everything in his safe, call Victoria Hayes one more time, and wait. He reached for his phone and dialed her number. Voicemail, immediate, as if the phone had been powered off or blocked. He sat with the 3 objects in front of him for a long time. He was a man who respected other people's privacy, who had never in 20 years of work opened a glove compartment without permission, never read a note left in a cup holder, never looked at anything that wasn't his business. But the electrical modification told him something had been done to this car, deliberately and intentionally. And the fact that Victoria Hayes had disappeared before returning for a vehicle she had paid for, or rather, had not paid for, he realized, checking his records within 24 hours of dropping it off, suggested that whatever was in this cavity was not incidental. He thought of the weariness in his own chest, the stone that had lived there for 18 years. He thought of his brother. He picked up the envelope. The name written on the outside of the envelope, in handwriting that was neat and unhurried, was Derek Johnson. Marcus read it twice. Then he set the envelope flat on the workbench and sat perfectly still for what might have been 10 seconds or 10 minutes he could not have said. His hands were steady. That surprised him. His mind was not steady at all. It was running through every possible explanation for how his brother's name could be written on an envelope inside a hidden compartment in the car of a woman Marcus had met for the first time 6 days ago. There were no explanations that made sense. He opened the envelope. Inside were 3 items: a folded letter on corporate letterhead, 2 pages dense, with single-spaced text, a photograph, slightly faded, of 3 people in what appeared to be a conference room, their names written in pencil on the back, and a folded copy of what appeared to be a contract, dated more than 18 years ago, bearing the name of a company Marcus did not recognize, and signatures he could not read. The letter was addressed to no one. It began with the words, "If you are reading this, then I was not able to deliver it myself." Marcus read the letter standing up, then sat down and read it again. It was written in the voice of a man who was frightened, but had decided to be methodical about his fear. It described a financial arrangement, a set of internal transactions conducted through a shell company that had been designed to divert licensing revenue from a software patent before the company went public. The letter described meetings Marcus's brother had attended as a junior compliance officer. It described what Derek had seen and what he had recorded. It described his intention to report what he had found. It described the pressure he had been placed under not to do so. It was dated 10 days before the Wednesday in November when Derek's car had left the highway. Marcus read the date 3 times. He put the letter down. He looked at the USB drive. He opened his laptop. The USB drive contained a folder structure that suggested it had been organized by someone methodical, someone who understood that what was on the drive might need to be navigated by a stranger. There were subfolders labeled by year and document type, and a root-level video file that had been placed at the top of the directory in a location that ensured it would be the first thing anyone opening the drive would see. Marcus clicked on the video file. The footage was grainy, the kind of resolution produced by an early-generation internal camera or a small recording device placed at distance, and the timestamp in the lower corner of the frame read a date that was 9 days before Derek died. The setting was a conference room, not the same one as in the photograph, but similar in its anonymity, its long table, its blank walls. There were 4 people in the frame. 3 of them were men Marcus did not recognize. Older, suited, the body language of people, accustomed to making decisions behind closed doors, and having those decisions carried out without question. The 4th person was a young woman, perhaps in her late 20s or very early 30s, seated at the far end of the table with the particular rigidity of someone who is uncomfortable but trying not to show it. The conversation in the video was partially audible. Enough. Marcus could make out the words enough to understand what was being discussed, which was the handling of what one of the men called the compliance problem, and what another man referred to, with the casual certainty of someone who had already decided, as something that would not be going any further. The young woman said something that Marcus had to replay 3 times to hear clearly. She said that she did not think this was the right approach. One of the men looked at her. He did not say anything in response. The silence in the video lasted 4 seconds. Marcus counted them. Then the conversation moved on to something else, and the young woman's posture changed, not dramatically, just slightly, a settling of the shoulders, a look that crossed her face for a moment before she composed herself. Marcus paused the video on that frame. He looked at the young woman's face for a long time. Then he opened a browser on his laptop and searched for photographs of Victoria Hayes from 20 years ago. The photographs he found confirmed what he already knew. The young woman in the conference room was Victoria Hayes. And the compliance problem the men had been discussing so calmly, the problem that would not be going any further, had been his brother. Marcus spent the next 3 days in a state of controlled internal turbulence that he would later describe to no one, because he had no one to describe it to except his mother, and he was not ready to tell his mother any of this yet. He worked his regular jobs during the day, spoke to his customers with the same careful attention he always gave them, ate dinner alone, and spent his evenings on his laptop or on the phone, tracing threads. He had never thought of himself as an investigator. He was a mechanic. He knew how to follow a system from symptom to cause, how to read what a machine was hiding by understanding what it was supposed to do and where it deviated. He applied the same discipline here. He started with what he knew: the letter, the video, the contract, the name of a company that no longer existed. He worked outward from there, methodically, the way he worked on an unfamiliar engine, not assuming, not guessing, just following the evidence to the next point and the next. He found the name of the company on the contract in the envelope, a limited liability company registered in Delaware 18 years ago and dissolved 2 years later. Its registered agent, a legal firm that had since been absorbed into a larger practice. He found records of the patent licensing dispute referenced in his brother's letter, buried in public filings from the period surrounding the company's initial public offering. He found 3 former employees of the company who had left within a year of the IPO, 2 of whom had signed unusually comprehensive non-disclosure agreements based on the legal boilerplate standard for the period. One of those former employees, a woman named Sandra Okafor, who had worked in the compliance department during the same period as Derek, had retired to a small town outside of Savannah. Marcus called her on a Thursday evening. She picked up. When he told her who he was and who his brother had been, she was quiet for so long that he thought the call had dropped. Then she said, very quietly, that she had been waiting for someone to call for a very long time, and that she had always been afraid it would never happen, and that she was afraid to say anything even now. He asked her why. She told him that the man ultimately behind the decisions made in that conference room, not the ones visible in the video, but the one who was not in the frame, the one who had sent the instructions that the others had executed, was not gone. He had not faded into retirement or irrelevance. He was still operating, still connected, still the kind of man whose name made other people careful about what they said aloud. Marcus asked her for the name. She told him she needed to think about it. She called him back 2 hours later and told him, and Marcus recognized it immediately, not because he knew the man personally, but because the name belonged to a face he had seen in the news recently, attached to a corporate board appointment and a philanthropic donation, and the kind of polished public profile that described a man who had spent decades building a reputation as a pillar of the business community. Marcus sat with the name for a while. Then he went to his safe and put the USB, the envelope, and the bank key inside it, and he drove home, and he sat in his kitchen until 2 in the morning, thinking about his brother. He thought about the weariness he had carried. He thought about the stone in his chest. He thought about 18 years of accepting an answer that had never been an answer at all. On the 8th night after the SUV had arrived at his garage, Marcus was alone in the shop after 10 o'clock, doing paperwork at his desk, when he heard the sound of a car pulling into the lot and stopping. He was not afraid. He had lived in this neighborhood long enough to know its sounds, and what he heard was a car engine going quiet, a door opening carefully, footsteps on gravel, unhurried. He walked to the side door and opened it. Victoria Hayes was standing in the parking lot, 20 feet from the entrance, dressed in dark clothing rather than her boardroom armor, without heels, without the composure she had worn like a second skin when he had last seen her. She looked, quite simply, exhausted. Not the ordinary exhaustion of a busy person. The deeper kind. The kind that lives in the eyes when a person has been afraid for a long time and has finally stopped pretending not to be. Marcus held the door open. She came inside. They stood at opposite ends of his workbench, and Victoria Hayes looked at the surface where the USB and envelope had rested 8 days ago, and then she looked at Marcus, and she said, "I know you found them." He told her he had. She nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself rather than to him, and she sat down on the stool at the end of the bench and folded her hands in her lap and began to talk. She told him that she had known about his brother, that she had known who Derek Johnson was and what he had tried to do, and that she had been in that room not as the person who made the decision, but as someone who had not stopped it. And that distinction had not brought her peace over the years, only a particular kind of guilt that had grown more precise and more unbearable. as she had grown older and more powerful. She told him that she had tried, in the months after Derek's death, to bring forward what she knew, and that she had been made to understand very clearly what would happen to her if she did. She had been young, she said. She had been frightened. She was not offering that as justification, she said, because she did not believe it justified anything. She had spent 18 years building a company and accumulating the kind of influence that she had originally thought might eventually give her enough protection to do what she had failed to do when she was young. But the man behind it all had grown alongside her, had remained connected, had continued to be untouchable in the particular way of people who understand how power works, and have spent a lifetime making themselves difficult to reach. She had put the evidence in the car 2 years ago, during a period when she believed she was being surveilled, intending it as a kind of dead drop she could access later. She had chosen Marcus specifically because she had known about him for years, had known he was Derek's brother, had kept a quiet, distant awareness of where he was and what he was doing, in the way of someone carrying guilt about a family they had wronged. She had come to his shop not because her car had broken down, but because she had decided it was time, and because she had not known any other way to begin a conversation she had been rehearsing for years. She looked at Marcus when she finished speaking. He looked back at her for a long moment, reading her face the way he read an engine carefully, without judgment, looking for what was true beneath the surface. He said, "You should have come sooner." She said, "I know." The room was quiet for a while. Marcus walked to his safe and began to take things out of it. What followed the night of that conversation was not fast, and it was not simple, but it had a momentum to it that Marcus had not anticipated, the particular momentum of truth that has been compressed for too long and finally finds a direction to move in. Marcus and Victoria spent the following 2 weeks working in a methodical parallel. Victoria with her lawyers and certain members of the press whom she trusted. Marcus with Sandra Okafor and 2 other former employees who, once Sandra broke her silence, found their own courage, and with a retired investigator named Raymond Cole, who had spent 30 years working financial crime cases and who reviewed the contents of the USB drive with the specific, unhurried attention of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of file. Cole had a habit of narrating nothing and observing everything, and when he finished his review on the second evening, he set down the final printed page and looked at Marcus across the workbench and said only, "This is real, and it is enough." He said it without drama, without the weight of a man delivering a verdict, just a clean, flat statement of professional assessment. Marcus had not realized, until that moment, how much he had needed someone with Cole's credentials to say exactly that. How much of the previous weeks he had spent wondering whether what he had found was what it appeared to be, or whether grief had made him read intention into coincidence. Cole's certainty settled something in him. The safe deposit key opened a box at a regional bank branch, held in a name Marcus did not recognize, a name that turned out to belong to a deceased attorney who had been Derek's one outside contact in the weeks before his death. Inside the box were additional documents, printed copies of financial records, and internal communications that corroborated everything on the USB and extended the evidentiary picture in ways that left very little room for alternative interpretation. The attorneys involved described it, in the careful, neutral language of people who deal in evidence for a living, as a remarkably complete record. What they meant, and what Marcus understood, was that Derek had known he might not survive what he had found, and had prepared accordingly. He had been careful to the last. He had been Derek to the last. The man whose name Sandra Okafor had given Marcus a man named Elliot Crane, who had served as the chief operating officer of the company 18 years ago, and who currently sat on the boards of 3 major corporations and 1 university, found himself, on a Tuesday morning in what he had expected to be an unremarkable week, the subject of a federal inquiry reopened on the basis of newly submitted evidence. His name appeared in the news by noon. By evening, 2 of the 3 corporate boards had requested his resignation pending review. Marcus learned about the arrest from a news alert on his phone. He was in the middle of replacing a wheel bearing on a customer's sedan. He set down his tools, sat on his stool, and read the headline twice. He called his mother. Ruth Johnson did not speak for a long time when Marcus told her. He could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, steady and slow, the way her breathing always was, even now. Then she said Derek's name. Just that. And Marcus, who had not cried in 18 years about any of it, who had learned to carry the stone so steadily that he sometimes forgot it was there, sat alone in his garage with the phone against his ear, and let himself cry. Not for long, but enough. His mother said, "I always knew it wasn't an accident." He said, "I know, Mama." She said, "Does it help?" He thought about that for a moment. He said, "I think it will." That was the truest answer he could give. The official process took months. The file was reopened. Derek Johnson's death was reclassified, pending the outcome of the broader investigation, from a single vehicle accident to a matter under active review. The family's lawyer, a young man named Arthur Green, who had taken the case on a contingency basis, after reading about it in the press, filed civil proceedings that Marcus had never intended to pursue, but which several people told him he had every right to. The corporate scandal around Elliot Crane expanded as investigators dug into the broader pattern of his conduct, and what had begun as a reopened inquiry into one old case grew into something considerably larger, implicating financial decisions that had affected a number of people beyond Derek Johnson. A number of careers quietly ended, a number of voices quietly silenced over the course of 2 decades. Marcus followed the proceedings with the steady attention of someone watching a debt being paid, slowly, in installments that were insufficient but still better than nothing. He did not enjoy the spectacle of it. He did not feel the clean satisfaction he had once imagined he might feel if this day ever came. What he felt was something quieter and more durable. Something that did not have a simple name. Something adjacent to relief, but heavier and older than relief. The feeling of a question finally answered, after it had been asked so many times, you had almost stopped believing an answer existed. Victoria Hayes resigned from Nexum Technologies 3 months after the night she had walked into his garage. Her resignation letter was brief and did not explain the reasons in detail, which was not unusual. What was unusual was what she announced the following week. A private foundation, funded with a significant portion of her personal assets, dedicated to providing legal resources and financial support to employees who came forward with evidence of corporate wrongdoing. She named the foundation after no one, gave it a plain institutional name, and declined most interview requests about it. Marcus thought about calling her. He did not call her. Some things did not need a conversation to be resolved. Some debts were paid in silence, and both parties understood that. And that understanding was its own kind of resolution. Not warm, not friendly, but real and mutual and sufficient. He respected what she had done. He believed she had meant it. He did not require more than that. Spring came to Atlanta the way it always did, loudly, impatiently, with a warmth that arrived 2 weeks before anyone expected it and then delivered 3 cold days as a reminder of what had just passed. Marcus opened the bay doors on the first genuinely warm morning and stood for a moment at the threshold between the interior of the shop and the pale, clean light of the parking lot, breathing in the particular smell of that season, the green edge of it, the way it made even the oil and asphalt smell of a working garage feel lighter. He had changed the sign above the door over the winter, just updated it. Nothing dramatic, cleaned the lettering, and added a second phone number for the expanded operation, because he had hired his first employee in 15 years, a young man named Terrence, who had grown up 3 streets over, and who could diagnose a transmission problem by ear in a way that reminded Marcus of himself at that age. He had watched Terrence work one afternoon with the quiet satisfaction of someone who recognizes something in another person that they once saw in themselves, something unpolished but real, something that only needed time and honest work to become what it was going to become. Life at the shop was, in most of the ways that mattered, the same as it had always been. The work was the same. The customers were largely the same, the regulars who had been coming for years, and the new faces who found him through recommendation. What was different was quieter than any of that. It was the stone in his chest, which had not disappeared exactly, because Derek was still gone and would always be gone, but which had changed in some essential way. It was lighter. It was less sharp. It occupied space in him, the way a scar occupies skin still there, still part of the landscape, but no longer a wound. Marcus had spent 18 years carrying a question that had no answer, and now he had an answer, and the answer was terrible, but it was true. And he had learned long ago that a true terrible thing was easier to carry than an uncertain nothing. His mother had said as much when he had visited her the week after the arrest, sitting with her at the kitchen table over coffee she had made too strong, as she always did. She had said, "Your brother knew what he was doing. He knew it could be dangerous, and he did it anyway because it was right. That is who he was." Marcus had said, "I know." She had said, "You are like him, you know, in the ways that matter." He had looked at his coffee for a while. He had said, "I hope so." She had put her hand over his on the table and left it there, and they had sat together in the kitchen of the house he had bought for her, while the morning moved around them, unhurried. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything, really. When he thought about it clearly, the way a man could move through decades of ordinary days, of work and weariness, and quiet dignity, carrying something heavy, and then one morning a car could pull into his lot, and the ordinary could open into something else entirely, something that asked more of him than he had expected to give, and he could give it anyway, and come out the other side with something he had lost so long ago he had almost stopped expecting to find it. He thought about that sometimes, in the quiet moments between jobs, when the shop was still and the tools hung in their places, and the light came in through the high windows, at the angle that made everything look clean and possible. He thought about what it meant to do your work honestly, in a world that did not always reward honesty. He thought about his brother, who had also done honest work in an honest way and had been punished for it, and about all the years between that punishment and its correction, and about how long the distance was between a wrong being done and a wrong being answered for, and how most people never got to see that distance crossed. He had been fortunate in that regard. He knew he had been fortunate. He carried that knowledge alongside the grief, the way you carry two things in two hands, not confusing them, not letting one diminish the other. Grief and gratitude were not opposites. He had learned that much. They could occupy the same space in a person simultaneously, without contradiction, without one canceling the other out. He thought about the woman who had walked into his shop exhausted and sat down on his stool and told him the truth at last. After so many years of carrying her own version of the weight, he thought about Sandra Okafor, who had been afraid to speak for 18 years and had spoken anyway, her voice steady on the phone, even though he could hear the fear underneath it. Steady because the fear was not bigger than the thing she needed to say. He thought about Raymond Cole, methodical and calm, reading through years of buried evidence with the expression of someone finishing a job another person had started and could not complete. He thought about his nephew, Derek's son, now 19 years old, who had called Marcus after the arrest was reported and said only, "Thank you, Uncle Marcus. I needed this." Marcus had sat with that call for a long time after hanging up, to have the story of his father's death corrected, not undone, because nothing could undo it, but corrected, named accurately, acknowledged as what it truly was mattered, in ways that words were too small to hold. He thought about all of it, and then he picked up his wrench and got back to work, because that was what he did, and because the work was still good, and because being good at something honest in an imperfect world was not a small thing. It was, Marcus had decided, a very large thing indeed. It was, perhaps, the largest thing a person could do to show up, day after day, and do the work well, and refuse to become someone the world had tried to make you, and keep the faith with what you knew to be true, even when the truth had no one to confirm it. It was on an ordinary morning, several weeks after the first warm day of the season, that the man walked in. Marcus heard the car before he saw it, a mid-size sedan, older model, the particular sound of an engine that had been well maintained but was beginning to need attention in the cooling system, a slight roughness at idle that someone who didn't know engines might not notice at all. He was under a truck when the footsteps crossed the concrete floor of the bay, unhurried, the footsteps of someone comfortable with waiting. Marcus rolled out on his creeper and stood up, wiping his hands, and saw a man in his mid-60s standing just inside the bay door, looking around the shop with the careful attention of someone taking an inventory. The man was well dressed in a quiet way, the kind of clothes that did not announce themselves, and he had the posture of someone who had spent most of his life working with his mind, but respected those who worked with their hands. He looked at the tools on the walls, at the organized workbench, at the photograph of Derek that Marcus had placed above his desk 3 months ago, a small photograph, not prominent, just present, just there, a young man in his early 30s, smiling in front of a car, the kind of smile that a person keeps in memory, long after the face that made it is gone. Then the man looked at Marcus. Marcus asked if he could help him. The man said, "You are Marcus Johnson, aren't you?" Marcus said that he was. The man looked around the shop once more. A slow survey, unhurried and respectful, taking in the small details that tell you what a place is really about: the clean floor, the orderly tools, the handwritten invoice pinned to the board, the coffee maker on the counter that had clearly been there for 20 years. Then he looked back at Marcus and he said, with something in his voice that was not quite reverence, but was in the neighborhood of it, "I heard this is the place where the truth gets found." Marcus looked at the wrench in his hand for a moment. He thought about 18 years. He thought about a USB drive and a cream-colored envelope and his brother's name written in careful handwriting on paper that had waited nearly 2 decades to be opened. He thought about his mother's hand on his at the kitchen table, and about the stone in his chest that had finally, after all that time, begun to lose its sharpest edge. He looked up at the man and smiled. Not a wide smile, not a triumphant one, but the quiet, genuine kind. The kind that means, "I know exactly what you mean, and I have earned the right to know it." He said, "I can take a look at what you have got. What seems to be the problem?" The man walked toward him, and the morning light came in through the open bay door behind him, warm and unhurried, the kind of light that landed on everything evenly, without deciding in advance what was worth illuminating. Marcus set his wrench down on the bench and picked up his shop rag, and as the man drew closer, Marcus looked at his face more carefully, not searching for anything, just present, just attentive, in the way he was always attentive, and he saw in the man's expression something he had learned to recognize over the years. Not trouble exactly, not urgency, something quieter than both of those, the particular look of a person carrying a question they have been carrying for a long time, who has finally arrived at the place where they thought the question might be answerable. Marcus had worn that look himself for 18 years. He knew it from the inside. He said nothing more right away. He simply waited, the way a good mechanic waits, not impatiently, not distantly, but with the full and focused availability of a person who understands that sometimes the most useful thing you can offer someone is your complete attention. The man stopped a few feet away and looked once more at the photograph of Derek on the wall above the desk. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Marcus, and Marcus looked back at him, and in the quiet between them, something passed that did not need words, a recognition of the kind that happens occasionally between people who have never met and yet understand each other in some essential way, because they have each been shaped by something the world does not always acknowledge. The morning continued around them, steady and ordinary and full of possibility. The coffee maker gurgled on the counter. Somewhere outside, a bird moved through the warm air. Marcus picked up his wrench again, ready, the way he had always been ready in this small and honest place he had built with his own hands. In this garage on the edge of a city that had not always seen him clearly, where the work was good and the truth, however long it had been buried and however many years it had taken, had a way of, eventually, inevitably, finding its way to the surface.